We welcome all our guests and all who watches us online. Since the time when the limitations of access to the internet resources started in Ukraine, we decided, a year after, we decided to organize a roundtable on this issue. We have among the participants to this roundtable Mr. Oleksander Burmahin, who is a lawyer, executive director of the NGO Human Rights Platform, Mr. Matthew Schaaf, director of Freedom House in Ukraine, and Iryna Chulivska, the head of NGO Laboratory of Digital Security. Since the time of the presidential decree prohibiting the access to a number of websites, of Russian websites, the attempts started and have continued systemic attempts to prohibit more and more the access to the internet, various internet resources. Why do I say systemic attempts? Because since the time of the presidential decree, there has been a number of attempts to prohibit to the internet providers the access to various internet resources. The lists of the websites who were considered by the Ukrainian authorities to be bad have been compiled. And so everybody in Ukraine now needs to, or has rather, to comply with the views of Ukrainian bureaucrats who have different views and the lists that they compile of the prohibited sites or the websites to access to which is going to be or needs to be prohibited in their view. They compile the lists that is then added by the Security Service of Ukraine. Then it is reviewed by the Parliamentary Committee on Information. And then a decision is made on whether to block this or the other website. We only learned about these practically lists of prohibited sites after one of the internet users wrote a request, information request to the Parliament of Ukraine. And so as of today, there are two lists that have been made public, including the internet resources that the Ukrainian authorities wanted to prohibit. The National Commission on Information Resources, the main regulator on the side of the Ukrainian government, when asked about, when we sent a request to them, told us that they were unaware of the existence of these lists. And then there was, in the Security Service of Ukraine, there is a department on information security, and there basically one bureaucrat who heads that department, in our view, it rests with him whether to prohibit or not prohibit this or the other website. There was also a law recently adopted, a bill on the protection of dignity and honor, and it was mostly aimed at fighting the child pornography, but more and more we see now the decisions of Ukrainian courts that prohibit the use and the access to certain internet resources guided by their own views. So the Security Service of Ukraine now has to when they impose these limitations, they install the so-called black boxes. That is a sort of equipment that allows them to trace and track and trace the users of the prohibited internet sites. So giving them basically unlimited control over these internet resources and over the traffic, internet traffic. We also would like to highlight the danger of manipulation when such such devices are used. Manipulation of internet traffic and information on the users. We object to these practically unlimited opportunities that are given in terms of blocking web resources to the security service of Ukraine without any court decision or in compliance with the decisions of governmental agencies who have any relation to the so-called cyber protection or cyber security. So, to cut a long story short, during the last year there have been a number of attempts by different Ukrainian special services, security services, and various governmental agencies to gain the instruments of control of access, and mostly blocking the access to certain internet resources that we consider, more and more internet resources that we consider unacceptable. Good afternoon. This problem of blocking the content of certain websites and the websites themselves, we have been registering these attempts by the Ukrainian authorities in our reports since 2014. For example, it started with blocking the access to such internet platforms as social media as Odnoklassniki and the others. In 2017, we also registered a number of breaches of freedom of the use of web, World Wide Web. Also, these breaches included the collection of data about the investigative journalists, which made investigative journalism in Ukraine even more dangerous. And these attempts are done under the veil of the struggle against the so-called anti-Ukrainian content. But we have been witnessing that the number of platforms, internet platforms in Ukraine for free communication, free exchange of information, they are less and less numerous, and there are fewer and fewer of them. Certainly, Ukraine needs to protect itself against the attempts to spread some disinformation or misinformation, and but these attempts should somehow be, well-grounded, well substantiated. We think that similar to such attempts to limit the freedom of speech in social life, these processes occur also with regard to the World Wide Web. If we analyze, for example, the large-scale blocking of some internet social networks, it is a very harsh measure that blocks the access of the public at large to various opinions, to different sorts of information. Therefore, the social media blocking can be, to block the access to social media is rather costly technologically and financially. It requires sophisticated equipment, but it's fairly easy to overcome these blocking efforts. As a result, we can say, summarizing, we can say that as a result of these limitations, a lot of members of the public have lost access to this public discussion of vital issues for Ukrainian societies, like family problems, various social problems, problems of the labor in Ukraine, and the limitations also that restricts the work of journalists, of politicians, and social activists. Therefore, we can see that the access to the news from various sources, to public discussions, to the means of expression of opinions should not. We consider that the access to these things should not be limited, and any limitations, if they are imposed by the authorities, should be introduced only on the grounds of detailed and clearly understandable arguments and proofs, not on the basis of just wide or broad views of correctness or incorrectness of this or the other type of behavior or information. We think that any pluralistic and socially developed country cannot be called as such, cannot be considered as such, if it introduces broad-scale limitations on the internet traffic. And we think that these efforts should be strongly balanced with the attempts to disinformation that distort also the democratic processes. I would like to emphasize that the Ukrainian Parliament needs to adhere to the a number of international conventions to which Ukraine adhered in terms of, or with regard to the freedom of information and the use of information in by social media and various internet outlets. We do not have a law here in Ukraine on, that envisages this option of blocking entirely the internet resources. It was only all of these blocking decisions were only made on the basis of the President of Ukraine's decisions. And this decree simply commanded, basically directed the National Security Council of Ukraine, National Security and Defense Council of Ukraine, and the National Commission on Communications to implement these limitations. So this was done, basically these decisions have been done by the, Soviet-type traditions when the government simply decides what is good and what is bad, and then start blocking, for example, the Odnoklasniki web platform, the Classmates platform, and then they continue with, sales of information taken from the Facebook and so on and so forth. So these things are not regulated, and for example, a lot of businesses were affected by some of the decisions, some people were doing their business by internet. They had, large scale of large-scale audiences, numerous audiences that were their customers and clients and so on. These businesses were affected, although they were trying to help for example, the internally displaced persons and some civic organizations in the east of Ukraine. But when these decisions are made, or the attention simply is drawn by the members of the public, is drawn to certain freedoms and to certain political rights, civic rights that can be implemented also with the help of internet resources. When the access to the internet resources is limited, these rights remain, so to say, unaccounted for. They cannot be implemented. And when the State Commission on Protection of Information and similar regulatory bodies of Ukrainian authorities, they start making these decisions, they are very similar to the Soviet-type approaches that are now present in Russia. And so some of the initiatives that were taken by the Russian government, they were also, so to say, amplified by the Ukrainian authorities, and they started using similar approaches by using these black boxes, these devices that can block technically the access to certain internet resources. We view all that as an attempt on the freedom of use of the internet, and therefore the representatives of the civic sector, they need to unite themselves in order to withstand these attempts to limit the access to the internet resources and to limit the internet traffic. So in the future, we plan to establish an association that would advocate the freedom of information in Ukraine, that would try to monitor, if not what happens in the minds of the people, we cannot yet do that, but at least what how the Ukrainian resources are used and what kind of access is provided or limited. I would agree. I'd say that with these slogans that, oh, we are in a war, we are the subject, we are the object of aggression, therefore we need to protect our national security, and we can do anything under this guise. At the beginning, we thought that these were some manifestations of dictatorial tendencies. Today, if we see in any of these, decrees or bills that are presented to the parliament, these the words "the national security of Ukraine" or the references to the hostilities in the east, the public has got gradually used to this that sort of argument, and it tacitly agrees to the limitations that are introduced or have been introduced by the government. Let me refer again again to the international legislation that provides for a number of very limited reasons and grounds for the limitation of internet traffic and so on. Here in Ukraine, let me emphasize it once again, we do not have a single act adopted by or approved by the parliament or enacted by the parliament that provides legal grounds for any limitations to the use of any internet resources. I have a question on whether there is any statistical data on how the audience of the Russian platforms changed that were prohibited by or have been prohibited by the Ukrainian authorities. This is the question to Ms. Iryna, and the other question is to Mr. Matthew. Are you aware of any instance of these laws on decommunization in the course of their implementation when someone's account has been blocked, for example, the Facebook account or any other internet platform? Well, I'm not ready to give you any figures on the changes of audience, of number of users of the blocked internet platforms, especially those that were in the Russian Federation, like Odnoklassniki. They are based in the Russian Federation. But still, it doesn't change our views on the need to more, cautious approach to any of these limitations. Well, with regard to this law on decommunization, we have indeed been monitoring the changes related to the implementation of that law, and you can see the data on the results of the implementation of that law in our reports on how the freedom of opinion was and freedom of political activities have been affected by this act on decommunization. But I can refer you to a law that, or rather, emphasize these parts of the law that prohibits the use of certain symbols, political symbols, related to the Communist Party's activities. But if it comes to the information discussions without any symbols, just the expression of opinions, I must say that we consider this act as limiting, the political discussions and political activism and civic activism and. Well, the Freedom House has in their report a number of cases listed when people were sentenced to prison terms for the expression of their opinions in the internet by internet resources. And some nationalist organizations even without referring you to such issues as LGBT rights and some other, expressions of political pluralism, these nationalist organizations, they already start on their own try to establish some form of monitoring and even control of the views expressed by the citizens via internet. So it's not only the government. We are now in the situation when here in Ukraine, the extreme right-wing nationalist organizations, they are trying to, somehow establish control, monitoring and control of the exchange of and expression of political and other views by the citizens of this country. So we need to probably be just more open in expressing our views and our aspirations to protect freedoms and rights in the information realm. My question is about a case that I witnessed myself when an internet resource was blocked by technical means, not the sectors of the internet networks, blocking, in fact, not one, but not only a targeted website, but the whole range of websites. Can these actions be limited? Well, certainly we can ask the authorities how they are doing this blocking, how they block the access. But unfortunately, when such requests have already been sent to the security service of Ukraine about how this blocking is done technologically, they reply that they are not authorized to divulge this information about the technological means of blocking. And as far as we understand, they are under the pressure from the government that they need to block certain internet resources. On the other hand, there are no legal grounds for that. And so some intermediary parties, for example, like those who represent a number of businesses who are interested in and who use internet resources in their work, they try to go to court, to bring to the court the governmental agencies that issue these orders for to block these internet resources. So it's this situation is the situation of some legal collision because the law of the country does not provide for these things, and there have been a number of attempts to reverse or even declare null and void the president's decree on the blocking of internet resources. But to the best of my knowledge, a couple of months ago, there was a court decision, the Supreme Court of Ukraine's decision on the case of a student of one of the universities here in Kiev against the government who wanted to reverse that decree. And the court decided, the court's ruling was that the president's decree stood and remained in force. Well, as we know, as a result of these blocking efforts by the Ukrainian government, a number of very popular web resources were blocked. And millions of people lost access to these web platforms and to the websites that were related to them. And therefore, we think that the users can try and be more active in protecting their rights. But there is also a certain role of providers in all that, because a lot of the members of the public, they are not aware of the role of providers of internet services. And as my colleagues have already mentioned, there is some information about unofficial attempts by the Ukrainian authorities to pressure the internet providers in order to make them block certain websites and certain web resources. There have been a number of cases when some of the internet providers were contacted unofficially, informally, by the representatives of the government who told them that they needed to block this or that internet resource. And this problem is rather complicated, and in reviewing it, we should look at all the sides, all the participants of the internet. I would like to add to what Ms. Iryna said, that there was a ruling of the court that was technologically speaking, was formulated very, very, unprofessional. The court ruling said that all the immaterial, all intangible rights of an internet provider were to be arrested for not complying with these prohibitions for blocking certain web resources. To me, this is an evidence that even the court authorities, the judicial authorities of Ukraine, they do not have any clear understanding of how it's all organized, how it all functions technologically. And certainly such more sophisticated technologies like DPI that you have mentioned, they are involved, but nobody in the judiciary branch understand these technologies. So we are speaking about the fact that these attempts to block internet resources, they have become a part of the policies of our authorities, of our government. It's already a part of domestic politics in this country. Therefore, ideally, all these bills should be prepared jointly by with the participation of the professionals, information sector professionals. Otherwise, there will be these absurd instances when there are some broadly formulated prohibitions, decisions by the government to prohibit the use of various parts of the internet and the internet providers, the use of these so-called black boxes, the technological devices that simply, filter all the access and block mostly all the access of all users to certain types of internet resources. Otherwise, so if it's not done in this way with the participation of the internet or information industry professionals, then there will be the repetition of these absurd limitations and situations of massive blocking and limiting of access to various internet resources. If there are no more questions, we can conclude our round table at this point. Thank you.